It seems basically inevitable at this point that gaming is going towards an all-digital future. No more physical games. Everything will just be downloads or streams on online marketplaces. There won't be physical games released, which means in essence that people can't collect video games anymore. Kids won't be able to go to stores and buy new releases, hold them in their hands, and have that physical connection to the game that we all have. Many of us here will buy, play, and collect physical media because that's where we have the strong connections to these games. There's a lot of nostalgia in the actual packaging, the art, the game disc. Reading the manual was huge. That was a big part of buying games for all of us growing up. The manual at this point has been phased out for like 10 years, which is crazy to even think, but my point still stands. This whole new generation of gamers and kids aren't going to have this physical media to grow a connection to. And if that is the case, then will that be the end of game collecting? From here, everything will just be downhill. Games will just continually get cheaper as no one wants to own these relics of the past. And it seems like that is the prevailing narrative right now amongst gamers and collectors, but I don't necessarily see it that way. At least I think it's going to be a lot more interesting than just everything goes down in price over the next 10 years. So say thank you to every single patron who helps support the channel as well as the YouTube members. I can't do this without you guys. Hit the like button and let's talk about the future of game collecting. So with everything going digital, that means new gamers, new people entering into the hobby aren't going to care about owning physical stuff. They aren't going to care about owning old games, so the hobby's just going to die. And I mean, yeah, that does make sense in a vacuum. These hobbies need continual new interest, new generations to enter into them, or it just dies. I assume no one watching this video collects toy trains or old Hummel figurines. Those were categories that were absolutely booming years ago, but no one new entered in and no one cared to keep it alive. But I think this notion of the hobby just dying is strongly rooted in the idea that this hobby is held together, or people only participate in this hobby because of nostalgia. So if someone doesn't grow up with physical games, then they won't be nostalgic for physical games, so no one will buy them. And I don't think that's necessarily true. As a collector myself, I have gone down many rabbit holes with both video games and other categories of collectibles that I never even knew existed when I was a kid. Some of my biggest collections, like my 200 Game Boy Advance games I own, are for a console that I barely ever played growing up, and I certainly never owned one growing up. Part of the fun of collecting is going after this stuff that you didn't have or that you learned about way later in life. And this idea that people who aren't growing up with physical games right now simply won't want to collect games in the future, it almost assumes that collecting for this category will just die out even if video games are going as strong as ever in the future. I don't think that's going to happen because I don't think the compulsion or the habit for people to want to own physical representations of this stuff, I don't think that's going away anytime soon. But with that said, I do think video game collecting is naturally going to evolve. I think collecting games, especially older generations of games, will become more specialized in how they are collected than it is right now. And I think a lot of the collecting will be done not so much because you want to play the games or anything, but simply because you want to have some stuff on your shelf. You want physical games in your collection. I strongly assume that emulating in 10 to 20 years is going to be way more popular than it is now. And truly, the only people still doing the physical stuff will be older people who have that nostalgia of actually putting a game in the console, blowing on it, and doing that setup. I don't think newer generations necessarily are going to care about that tangible experience. Let's just talk about comic collecting for a minute here, because they still do print comic books, but obviously it's long past the prime since comics were like the most popular thing. I don't personally know anyone who reads comic books, but I do know many people who collect comic books. And those people have great attachment to very specific issues or storylines, even if they've never read the original comic. As comics and superheroes evolved and became more mainstream, they were brought to life via different means than the original medium. Comics became games, movies, amusement parks, basically everything, right? Newer generations were introduced to these characters and stories not through comic books. And people who are exposed to this stuff, if they are someone who enjoys collecting, because like, you know, most collectors are just, that's just how they are. People who collect things are people who collect things. So if you were one of those people, you get introduced to all this superhero stuff, comic book stuff, and then you go back and you find these things that you can collect that represent the characters. And through that discovery process, you work your way way to the original medium. I have never collected or read comic books in my life, but yeah, I would love to own the first appearance of Spider-Man if it didn't cost thousands of dollars. And I assure you, people aren't buying those comic books because they simply can't read the story anywhere else. So when we go back to video games and we see the Nintendo Cinematic Universe starting with the Mario movie, Super Mario Land amusement park is now open, more and more TV shows are being based off of video game IPs, this hobby doesn't necessarily need new physical games to continually be printed in order for new collectors to be created. People who are introduced to gaming and have that collector gene in them who want to own some gaming stuff will inevitably go down their own rabbit holes. They'll look at stuff that's been released in the past, they'll find stuff that interests them and they resonate with. Now, I do actually think that most video games, especially retro video games, will lose most of their player interest in the next, say, 20, 30 years, and I don't think a lot of them are going to be collected either. The NES and Super Nintendo have like 700 games each, the PS2 has like, what, 1,800? Inevitably, the vast majority of these games are just going to fade away. No one's going to care about owning them. No one will want to play them. That's naturally going to happen, I do think. But with that, we will also see more concentrated collecting on the specific titles that people decide to place value or weight on. Say NES and Super Nintendo will each have around 100 games each that people really care to collect. And it might be certain niches or genres or people going after landmark video games that really changed a genre or the biggest games on the console. The games that have been ported forward in recent times might become massive collector's items in the future. Take Mario RPG, for example. There's now a new generation of people playing that on the Nintendo Switch. The new copy exists for people to easily access on the gaming side of things, while the old copy becomes somewhat of a grail for people to strive for. And if video game collecting does get away from the notion of simply playing the games, if that becomes less popular with collectors, then it is also possible that we see cartridges themselves lose value, but we see boxes and manuals or even sealed copies go up in price even more. We've already seen how crazy it's gotten with some factory sealed video games where there simply aren't nearly as many of them to go around. Rather than everything simply going down in the future, I see it more as some stuff is going to go up a lot while some other stuff goes down. The hobby isn't just going to die, but it's going to change in where collectors place value, what are the new generations interested in, what games are going to be kept alive by the new generation. Right now with PS2 collecting, some of the grails on the console are those niche horror games like Kuon, Haunting Ground, Rule of Rose. There's no guarantee in 10, 20 years from now that people are still going to gravitate towards those titles. The games that are rare, super valuable, super sought after, all of that can change as we go through generations. Now, the last thing I do want to touch on here, because I don't see many people talk about this, but if new physical games aren't being printed, then people can't spend their money on new physical games, right? There's going to be a lot of people who simply stop buying video games when you can't get physical. Now, I don't think that's actually going to affect gaming. I think gaming itself is going to be fine. Gamers are still going to purchase these games. But for those collectors who also enjoy the physical, they now can't spend money on brand new games. So it's possible that these people now take their entire new game budget and they start cycling it backwards. They start buying PS4, PS3, PS5, Switch, whatever, right? They start buying games that they didn't experience at the time. Older video games actually could see a sharp increase in price because people now start spending more money on older games. Hoarding and coveting the old media could become even more popular than it already is. And even if no one else joins this hobby, I assume it still has 20, 30 years to go here before we can even begin to call it dead. Before most collectors are like too old to keep collecting and gaming, or frankly just dying out. So long as video games remain as prominent as they are in culture and gaming keeps pushing ahead, I just don't see this hobby going anywhere anytime soon. But this all just might be copium from someone who has way too much money spent on video games. So let me know what you think is going to happen to the hobby in the future. Hit the like button before you go, and I will see you guys in the next video. Bye.